You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. In this episode, I'd like to share some thoughts with you that I've had about a question I've been considering. And that question is, why is it so scary to start a business? Because I know a lot of people who would really like to start a business, but it is a pretty daunting challenge. So I've been thinking about, why is it so scary? Now, certainly there are lots of very understandable reasons why people find it scary starting a business. And I mean, for example, there is clear financial risk involved in starting a business, and that is understandably scary. If you want to, you can find lots of statistics on business startup failure rates, and they demonstrate that when you start a business, you're entering a field where there is a high statistical chance of failure. I've done a podcast about that, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. However, there's something else going on, which I think is really important in why it's scary to start a business, and that is that we have all been conditioned to think of ourselves as employees. We've all been indoctrinated to view ourselves as lifetime employees. And this self-perception or self-belief goes very, very deep because it is conditioned. It's something that we've been trained to think. And I'd like to give some examples of what I mean by that employee conditioning, and how you may experience it yourself, how I certainly experience it. And I'd also like to talk about where I think it comes from. And I hope that by talking about this and thinking about this, it can be helpful in overcoming your conditioning. So I want to give you some examples of what I think employee conditioning is like. And just to provide some context to this, this is a really strange contradiction of our times. We live in a time when it's never been a better time to be an entrepreneur than now. The opportunities for starting your own business now are amazing, even compared to one generation ago. The fact that we have, through the internet, access to a global marketplace, and we have the opportunity to start and run a business from pretty much anywhere in the world for most kind of businesses. We can connect with a global audience. There are a huge number of really easy to use automation tools, which can make your business hugely efficient compared to one generation ago. Reporting and analysis of what's happening in your business is so easy now compared to how it used to be in the past. You can get great transparency about what is going on, how money is flowing through your business, how it's performing, and so forth. And we do live in an increasingly prosperous world. It may not look like that sometimes, but if you read a book like The Rational Optimist by Ridley, you can see from the evidence that actually, in general, the world that we live in now is significantly better than it was in previous generations in pretty much any aspect that you choose to measure it with. So it's a great time to be an entrepreneur, and yet we are all trained and conditioned to think like worker drones and to think of ourselves as employees. And that's an amazing contradiction of our times. And I want to give you some examples of what I mean by that and what it looks like. So, for example, the norm in our culture is to get a job, to go out there and find a job that somebody else has made that you can take and earn a wage from it. We've been conditioned to think that we need to go out and get a job, as opposed to starting your own business where you make opportunity for yourself. You create jobs, if you like, or opportunities for yourself and others. You don't wait to go out there and take a job that somebody else has created. Why not just make one yourself? Create your own job. We think in the norm, the conditioning that we receive is to think of preparing for life in terms of certification from somebody else. So, the idea is that you go through school and you pass your exams at the end. You get your piece of paper that shows you that you've done your school exams, and then you maybe go on to university and pass those, and then maybe after that you go on for some kind of professional certification and pass those, and you look to somebody else to approve that you are capable of doing something by giving you a certification, as opposed to finding a way to be helpful to other people and demonstrating that helpfulness. That's the entrepreneurial route, is that you simply are good at something. You're good at helping people. For people who are useful and helpful, they don't need certification. They don't need exams. Another aspect of employee conditioning is this idea that we look to authority figures to give rewards. So as an employee, you think of getting a raise or getting a promotion. And we're conditioned to think around this idea that it's our relationship to our supervisor or our boss that is going to be the source of moving onwards and upwards in our career path, which is a completely different way of thinking to that you engage in when you're starting your own business, where rather than looking to authority figures for rewards, you look to your peers, customers in the marketplace, as equals. You look to them for reciprocation. It's a value for value trade relationship where you're not looking to an authority figure for rewards. You're looking to somebody who's on the same level as you, who you can both benefit from a win-win trade type of situation. The employee mentality really blocks you from thinking it in those terms. Another aspect of the employee conditioning that we all get is we take it sort of for granted that somebody else decides, what our work is about and gives direction and provides leadership. We're basically trained to think like followers and to look to somebody else to provide the purpose and the goal for us. And if you think about it, it's a completely unnatural way of thinking. As an entrepreneur, if you start your own business, you provide the purpose and you create the organization. You're actually the one who is in charge of yourself. You lead yourself and you follow your own purpose. Another aspect of employee conditioning that we've all received, I think, is to try and always make ourselves busier and take on more responsibility within our jobs. And this is the idea that, you kind of progress in your career by gaining more and more responsibility and becoming more and more integral to the business. It leads to this thing that is actually been given the name the Peter Principle, which is that every employee gets promoted just above their level of competence. So in other words, everyone gets given so much to do and so many responsibilities that they're constantly kind of firefighting, and everyone is constantly sort of working just beyond what they're really capable of doing into a level of where they're not competent, where they're incompetent. It's interesting to contrast that with the whole sort of direction of entrepreneurship, which is to be a business owner, not a business doer. When you start your own business, your ultimate goal is to make yourself redundant, is to remove yourself from the production process, to take away your responsibilities within the actual business operation itself, so that you step back and become just the business owner. And of course, in doing so, there's a lot of work to do in terms of designing the business and getting the whole thing going. But it's a completely different way of approaching sort of what you're trying to do compared to this employee mentality. Another aspect of the employee mentality is that we are all conditioned to look to somebody else to tell us how we're doing. So, when you are in a job, you look to your boss to give you your yearly appraisal or, evaluate your work in however they do it. And that's sort of the ultimate judgment on how you're doing, is how your boss evaluates your work, which is, of course, completely different to the experience of being an entrepreneur, where you have to evaluate what you're doing and you have to find objective measures to get really good objective information on how your business is doing. Nobody else is going to tell you how you're doing. You have to decide that for yourself based on the facts of reality. I think we all have this employee conditioning, that we've all been indoctrinated in thinking of ourselves in this way. And that is one reason why it's really scary to start a business, because you're going against that conditioning. And I'd like to say a few words about where I think that comes from, that conditioning. I think there's two real sources of employee conditioning. One is a style of parenting that is the norm, which is compliance parenting, and the other is compulsory schooling. So when I say compliance parenting, what I'm talking about is the kind of parenting that most kids receive, which is about punishments and rewards for compliance. Now, parenting overall in the last couple of hundred years has been getting increasingly better, just in terms of like the way that children are treated, and in particular levels of violence towards children have overall been declining in lots of ways. However you measure that, whether that's to do with physical violence, hitting kids, or other acts of violence on kids, they've been in decline. So overall, I think parenting is gradually, on average, getting much better than it has been historically. But most of us still experience a style of parenting which is about punishment and rewards for compliance. And really what this means is that this model of being an employee and having a boss kind of comes from the home, because most parents behave like bosses, and they're like really bad bosses actually, and they treat their kids as abusive bosses would treat their employees. They give them punishments and rewards in order to get them to do what the parents want them to do, as opposed to teaching children negotiation and having a negotiated relationship with kids. And the important thing about that is it sets all of us up for a view of interacting with others which is hierarchical. It's about who's in charge, who's giving out the orders, and who are the subservient ones whose job is to follow the orders, comply, or to try and get rewards for compliance and avoid punishments for non-compliance. And these kind of hierarchy games then get set up in all of our minds, as opposed to the experience of learning how to negotiate, where everyone is a respected individual who has an opportunity to get their needs met through negotiation, through give and take in a kind of win-win process. There's very little modeling of that kind of relationship that goes on in most family situations. And that's why I think people get set up for thinking of themselves as employees, or alternatively as bosses. They can flip over into the other part of the hierarchy. And the second source of this employee conditioning is compulsory schooling. The thing about schools is that they are factories for creating employees. They've pretty much got that explicit purpose. Their aim is to reproduce this system of jobs and employee relationships. And of course, all the people who work in schools, all the teachers, they're employees themselves. None of them are entrepreneurs. They're all employees, and they're all there handing over the same conditioning that they themselves have received and teaching you to become an employee. Is it any wonder, given that every single one of your teachers is an employee, that they taught you to think like one? Compulsory schooling is like prison for children, and we are all ex-cons wandering around trying to find our way in the world with the conditioning that we've been given in that environment. It's an experience of being in a forced environment for over 10 years where there's an authority figure at the front of the room who creates all this make work that you have to fulfill as a school kid. And you learn that it's not really about what the work that you do is for. It's more about your relationship with the teacher and whether or not the teacher is going to give you the grades that you need in order to pass whatever exams they are, and so forth. And again, this sets up all of these things that I talked about in terms of the employee mentality. Being a follower, not a leader, of looking to somebody else to give you rewards, somebody else to determine how you're doing, and to tell you, what your work is, basically. And it's very hard, having gone through all those years in school and at home too, of conditioning to think of ourselves as followers who need to comply, and to think of ourselves as people who get given stuff to do by somebody higher up whose job it is to do all the thinking, who's really in charge. It's very hard to break out of that and break your conditioning to go and start your own business and effectively think for yourself. And I really mean think for yourself, because I don't think there is such a thing as an entrepreneur mentality. There's an employee mentality, because the employee mentality is a set of constraints on the way that you think that limit your creativity and limit your potential. Whereas thinking like an entrepreneur really just means thinking like a rational individual, thinking for yourself, basically. You know, a good entrepreneur is just a well-adjusted, rational individual who's able to think for themselves, take in information and process it, and make decisions based on objective evidence. That's what makes a good entrepreneur. And who's also able to trust their intuition and their insights without second-guessing themselves all the time because of, you know, all the conditioning that they've received. So I think the biggest challenge in starting a business, the thing that makes it so scary really is not the financial risk. It's that in order to do so, in order to start a business, you have to challenge the employee conditioning that you've received. So this is something I'm thinking about at the moment. And if you're interested, I can do more podcasts about it. And it's also something that I'm writing about, because this is really the subject of the book that I'm writing at the moment on entrepreneurship. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, and any questions or thoughts or contributions that you have, please do get in touch. And if you have a chance, if you enjoy the show, please do also leave me a review on iTunes. That would be a big help. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.